Thank you so much for that introduction, and it is good to be back here in this building. As I was saying, just before the start of the program, I feel like every left-wing organization in Philadelphia has their events here in this space, in this room. I feel like I've been here for political debates. I've been here for I think I've debated in this room as, a debater, in fact. It's just a really, really, really important space that is open to people from all over the city and that people feel comfortable using for all kinds of things. And I always think of this building as really kind of like a beacon of freedom of speech here in the city of Philadelphia, just because a lot of different kinds of groups, maybe some that don't have the most mainstream views in the world, can find a good, well-run space in Center City and hold events and have forums and things like that. So I think it's just great, and so it's good to be back. And also, I always recommend this building as the best low-budget wedding option in Center City. In fact, one of my best friends got married upstairs on our recommendation for what they wanted to do. And I've seen a lot of people here over the years. I've never had any complaints from anyone who got married here. So it's really nice to be here with all of you and for the first time at the Sunday program. So, so just really quick, a little bit about myself. I'm in the middle of my second term. I was first elected in 2022. The representative prior to me for my district was Brian Sims, if people know who that is. Prior to that, it was Babbitt Josephs, who served for 28 years. So it is I represent the most urban district in the entire Commonwealth. I have also the smallest geographic district out of the 203 House seats across the entire state. Mine is physically the smallest because my constituents live in apartments, they live in buildings, they live in walk-ups, and in some cases row homes, but very, very dense. And so it makes my district incredibly unique, right? We are impacted really uniquely in different ways. Cycling is one. We have more people who ride bikes, especially to work as commuters in my district than anywhere else in the entire Commonwealth. And we also have more people who walk, just people who are pedestrians. And so I think about those issues a lot when I'm in Harrisburg, and then obviously mass transit, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point today. But my district is more reliant on SEPTA than any other district. We have more bus lines, we have more transit lines, we have both the suburban station and the Market East hub, and we just have so many people that live in my community in Center City specifically because they don't want to own a car, and they specifically want to be able to walk, or they want to be able to ride a bike, or they want to be able to take mass transit wherever they are going. And so, these SEPTA cuts that have been proposed and are now on hold, probably indefinitely, these are issues that impact my district in ways that don't impact, let's say, suburban Montgomery County, or even some of the rural districts. So it's a unique position. It's a very unique set of things that we advocate for. Prior to being elected to the House of Representatives, I started out as a newspaper reporter. I worked for the Philadelphia Daily News, and then I worked for WHYY, the NPR affiliate here in Philadelphia, covering politics and covering government. And eventually I just wanted to get more directly involved in what was going on, and so I went and worked for a number of elected officials, doing communications, and then owned my own business for a while as well, doing kind of communications and public relations, helping people work with journalists, particularly elected officials work with journalists. And then so when Brian Sims retired, I ran for the seat. So that's just a little bit about me, and that wasn't maybe the bio. I want to talk, though, mostly today about Little Scandinavia, which is an issue that I have been advocating for the last, 2 years or so since I've been in office, in particular through the Appropriations Committee. And so when it was maybe 6 months into my first term, I was invited by a constituent of mine to go and visit SCI Chester, which is a state correctional facility, which is just outside of Philadelphia in Chester, about 20 minutes from Center City. And this constituent of mine works at Temple University, Miss Eileen, and she does a lot of mentoring and work with people who are incarcerated, particularly people who are long-term lifers, people who have been sentenced for long sentences. She spends a lot of time in the SCI system working with folks who have been incarcerated. And so she brought me to this event at SCI Chester. And what this event at SCI Chester was, it was in their gymnasium. And it was a bunch of big circular tables that they had rolled in. It kind of felt like a high school prom a little bit, I would say. But it was kind of like a seniors fair and a senior event, and specifically programming that was designed to like highlight and uplift what the facility was doing for its senior residents. And when I say senior, I'm talking about senior citizens. I'm talking people who are 65, 75, some of them in their 80s. These are people who we have we're going to talk about a lot of different things, but I'm going to make some side comments here that aren't necessarily about Little Scandinavia, but here in Pennsylvania, we have some of the strictest laws when it comes to particularly felony murder statute. And in particularly first-degree murder and most second-degree murder, you wind up with life sentences with no possibility for parole. And it sounds great in a TV ad, right? It sounds great when you're debating on the House floor of Representatives. You're going to put somebody away. But what it has meant in practical case is that we have a large and growing population of seniors in our correctional facilities who, yes, did something horrible when they were 18, 19 years old. No one is questioning that. The people that I've met and talk about what they did when they were younger, and I will get to that in a second. But remember, these are people who did something terrible when they were 18 or 19. We as a society as a state, decided we were going to have the strictest life in prison that we could have, and so now we've got a bunch of senior citizens, right? So, leaving aside at this time, the ethics of that and the morals of that, right? From a financial situation, you have people who have been locked up their entire adult lives. The medical care in prison, not great. The health care in prison, not great. The general environment, quality of life in prison, not great. So people have lived these incredibly difficult lives for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. And they're stuck. And, there's always, so they have very bad health, obviously, and then that leads to like tremendous medical bills at the end of people's lives that the state, is required to do. And we don't even do compassionate release very much in this state. We don't even really let people out when they're medically ill. There's some of that, but it's not nearly, at the level of which is required given the number of people who are incarcerated and have these kinds of health issues. So that's the situation that we have in the correctional situation. And that's why this event at SCI Chester was all about what the programs are, what they're doing for seniors, what kind of activities, that kind of stuff, because they've got this huge and growing senior population. So, but while I was there, I was talking to someone who was at my table, who was someone who was actually someone who had been resentenced. And they had been given a life sentence for a homicide they committed when they were juvenile, and the law changed because of the Supreme Court. And so a lot of people who had those sentences from when they were juveniles, they were resentenced, so he had been resentenced to like 20 and 30 years for something, and he had already done something like 26, so he was getting ready to be released at that point. And he told me he was like, first off, I never thought that I was going to be released, because no one ever gets released. And that's the first thing that they tell you when you get to prison is you have a life sentence, you're not going anywhere. And so he never thought that he was going to get out. He wound up being assigned to this unit called Little Scandinavia, which was an experimental unit that had only been up and running for about a year. And he told me about it. I'd never heard of it at that point. I mean, I worked for the state senate, I worked for the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. I mean, I know a lot about criminal justice and public policy, but I had never heard of Little Scandinavia. And that was, I think, partially because it had been started kind of under COVID. The Secretary of Corrections under the Wolf administration, the previous governor, had wanted to do this, and had got it up and running, but then COVID had shut everything down. So it was back up and running again. He's telling me about it. And then what essentially it was an experimental prison unit that was already up and running at SCI Chester that was modeled off of the Scandinavian model of how the correctional system works in those countries. And it came from an exchange program between correctional officers in Norway and Pennsylvania Department of Corrections officials going on basically an exchange program where they went back and forth and looked at each other's systems. So when the folks from Pennsylvania got to Norway, they saw something that was very, very different from what they were used to, dealing with here in Pennsylvania and the way that our system is set up. And the most simplest way that I can put it is that people are treated like human beings, and there's an assumption that they're going to come back into society at some point. And that what prison and what correctional needs to be about is about that rehabilitation of whatever brought them there in the first place, so that at some point they can re-enter society in a productive way. And so what does that mean? Now there's so much going on in Norway. I mean, they have, for every prison guard, they have a social worker, they have educators. I mean, it's a very, very, very different system that we're very, very far away from here, even with this unit. But these folks from the Pennsylvania correctional system, they came back from this trip to Norway and they said, what are we gonna do? What can we start thinking about how to do this? And so they set up a unit. The first thing that this unit has that I think is, speaks to where we are in our current system, but also just speaks to the mental health aspect, is everybody gets their own bunk, okay? It's not solitary confinement. You can come and go as you want into the main area of the unit, but you're no longer sharing a 8.5-foot cell with another person where you have a bunk bed and a toilet and you're living together. That is how 90% of our system is throughout Pennsylvania. That's how all prisons are throughout the whole country. Pretty much are these very, very tight packed and people, living in a cell with another person like that. As you can imagine, that is a very difficult environment to live in, particularly if it's someone that you don't get along with, particularly if it's someone who is, doing drugs, and that's not something that you want to be around. There's so many different reasons why this innovation was a life-changing thing for the people that are on the unit. So that's the first thing. But the second thing about the unit is that, because if you're coming from the assumption that people are going to be re-entered and reintegrated into society, then you have to also look at the reality that people, when they're in prison, in the current way the system is set up, people are warehoused and their independence is completely taken away. You are told when you're going to go outside, when you're going to come inside, when you're going to eat, when you're going to go to the cafeteria, when you're going to eat in your cell, when you're going to go to the bathroom, when you're going to use the shower, a million other things. Even if you're doing enrichment activities, even if you're doing things like, trying to get a degree or furthering your education, workforce training, all of that is you have to do it at the whim of someone else. And so people, especially people who have been incarcerated for a long time, they lose the ability to have that independent thought and ability to exist in real society. And so that's kind of the first big thing of a tenet of how they think about it in Little Scandinavia. So instead of things being organized okay, from this time to this time, this time to this time, there's much more independent movement on the cell block. And that means that people can kind of choose what they want to do and how they want to do it, whether it's laundry, whether it's cooking their own meals. That's another big thing with Little Scandinavia. People in prison lose the ability to cook for themselves, or they forget how to do it, because it's not a part of their daily life anymore. And so one of the things on those units is that people cook, right? And they cook for themselves, and they cook for their guards. And that's the other big difference. The difference is the relationship between the COs and the inmates. The difference, if you're in a normal prison, especially even in other parts of SCI Chester, you are not allowed to fraternize with your inmates. You are not allowed to have relationships with them that go beyond telling them go here, go there. You're not getting to know people. I'm not talking about inappropriate relationships. I'm just talking about learning people's names and having some kind of a back and forth. Little Scandinavia, the guards are encouraged to develop those relationships. And that's a huge difference in the tone of the unit. And it's bizarre, being a prison guard is not an easy job, okay? It's often, except Chester is not an example of this, but both SCIs are in rural areas where they are the only economic option. They are the economic engine of a lot of those regions. And so these are jobs where there are a lot of times there are not a whole lot of other types of work available. People will go and work in a prison. It's a very high stress environment. You've got a lot of people that don't like you, you're responsible for, and so, or have reason not to like you. And so, for all those reasons, people who are prison guards, they have high mortality rates. They have, a lot of different health and other things that are really, really serious because of the working conditions that they're under. So I'm talking to one of the guards on Little Scandinavia, and he's like, I lost 30 pounds because I did a weight loss challenge, eating healthy, with the guys who are on the block. And they're cooking for themselves and they're learning about nutrition. Okay, so you get the point, is that there's this level of independence that develops, but there's also just a difference in how the American correctional system teaches its correctional officers to interact with the inmates. And this breaks through that as well. So there's lots of other things that I could get into. I mean, laundry, doing your own laundry, right? And like being responsible for doing that. I mean, obviously people that are on Little Scandinavia right now, they also have access to a lot of other enrichment, but that's all throughout SCI Chester. It's like all kinds of stuff. It's workforce training. I mean, people are barbers. I could go through it all. So, okay, so I meet this guy, he tells me about it. I'd never heard about it. I come back and decide that in a month or two, we're gonna go back and visit and I'm gonna get a tour. And so I go back and for the first time, and this is about 2 years ago, for the first time, go visit Little Scandinavia, can see immediately that there is something special going on. Like I said, the conversation that I had with the COs that were assigned to that unit, it was like jaw-dropping how much they had to say that was so interesting and not what you expected. So, okay, so I come back and I'm like thinking about this, right? And so now I'm trying to, how much time, what am I doing? I'm sorry, I'm blabbling on here.
I'd say another 10 minutes.
Okay, okay, and then we'll do questions, right? Yes, okay, sorry to interrupt there, but I'm just want to make sure I'm not going up here. Okay, so it's important at this point to talk about the sort of political dynamic that exists in Harrisburg. Pennsylvania is one of the only states in the entire country where we have a Republican-controlled Senate and a House controlled by the Democrats, or vice versa, where there's a split, okay? And so what that means, everyone wants to talk about bipartisanship and what's so wonderful, it should be such a great thing that it has to go through, but what that means in practicality is not much is getting done, all right? And because the gap between the two parties right now is very, very wide. And we don't want to do the things that they want to do, and they don't want to do the things that we want to do. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit in the Q&A. But for me, what it means in this instance is there's not a lot of interest in criminal justice reform, which is something that I am interested in. But there's not a lot of appetite in the Senate side of the building, and even frankly within my own caucus among the Democrats in the House, for criminal justice and criminal justice reform. Not right now. So what I realized was that Little Scandinavia did not need a legislation to continue. It was something that was in the governor's power, as the governor can control the prisons, the Department of Corrections. They're the ones that can decide whether or not Little Scandinavia, Governor Shapiro, he's the one that can decide whether or not this unit remains at SCI Chester. The legislature doesn't really have anything to do with it unless they proactively, ban it or something, which I wouldn't think that they would since it's been up and running for a year. So what we did was we organized basically a campaign over 7 months of events that were designed to call attention to Little Scandinavia and call on the governor to make the unit permanent. And the way that we did that, we brought someone who had been on the unit to Harrisburg, and he spoke to maybe 30 or 40 lawmakers. We held press conferences where we talked about the unit, where we brought people who had been on it, people who knew about it, advocates, to draw attention to it, started to get more media coverage of it. And obviously we communicated with the governor, and we communicated with the Secretary of Corrections. This is something that we thought was really important and had a lot of potential. And it kind of culminated with, I think, 36 different state house members signing a letter that went to the governor and the Department of Corrections saying, we want this Little Scandinavia to be made permanent, and we want it as part of the budget, and we want, we think that this is something that's worth continuing. And so the first budget, we sent this letter, we didn't get it. We were told by the administration, this is an ongoing kind of academic study, which it is. It's a partnership with Drexel University, so they're going to monitor, the outcomes. But they were like, we agree with you that this has merit, and we're going to continue it as it is right now, but at this time, we're not ready to say we're going to make it permanent. That was the first budget, my first budget as a lawmaker. We came back around, we did a lot more advocacy, did a lot more meetings, we came back, and a lot more media coverage, and we came back around, and the second time around, the Shapiro administration came back and said, okay, we have enough data now, it's been up and running enough. Not only are we gonna make it permanent at SCI Chester, we're gonna expand it to 3 different prisons throughout the state. And they're on the record in public saying this, that they're gonna bring the concept from SCI Chester to at least 3 different facilities. They don't know yet which facilities. I've been told it's very likely that one of the women's prisons will be one of them. We're waiting to see how certain things shake out with the budget, but there is a commitment from the administration not only to make it permanent at SCI Chester, but to expand it now to other places in the corrections thing. So it's very, very, very exciting. And I give the governor a lot of credit for being willing to continue on something that his predecessor started and expand it, and stick your neck out a little bit about something like this. So, okay, I think that's the story. And I would keep an eye out, folks, for this, not only as we try to move and expand it statewide. I do also think that there's now more interest here in the city about doing it as well, that we could model the city jails a little bit more this way. So, anyway, with that, any questions? Thank you.
Yeah, wireless mic. Yeah, it's getting like a low bass.
I think I banged into the cord. I think as long as I don't do that again.
But yeah, let's open it up for our talk back. So questions, comments. Let's do questions first. Try to keep them brief. Be respectful.
Yeah. So it was under you started talking about the senior population. Is this a program limited to seniors? It's the whole population.
So it's the whole population, and it's because it's an academic study, it is not what they call an honor block. And what that means is an honor is like good behavior, you get in a better block, you get to a better housing situation, just different amenities, you can imagine they have a tiered system. But because they really wanted to measure whether this could work, it was random who was in this particular one. Not entirely. I think as time was going on, I realized they were a little bit selective of who they picked. But for the new units that are going to be in other places, what the administration has said to me is that they want to put some of the tougher folks in those. They want to actually start with people that have serious types of felonies, homicides, things. I mean, they want to see if it works. Their thing is like, I think there was one fight in Little Scandinavia in the entire 2 years that it's existed. And that number right there that is not how prison is. I mean, there's a fight a day on most blocks. So the administrators are like, hey, if we can replicate this, that is what we're trying. That's what they're interested in more than anything.
So just to follow up, so they believe that this program will make prison safer.
Yes, absolutely. And I think for the people who are the COs that I've talked to, I think there's a feeling that it dials the temperature down. It just changes how people are relating to each other at just a human level. And it's that's what I think is the most powerful thing about it. It calls upon us to reconsider what the relationship has to be between people who are incarcerated and the guards and everybody who works at those facilities.
Thanks so much for coming and thanks for your talk. You mentioned that this was an academic study partnering with Drexel. I'm curious as to what outcomes were being measured. I mean, I assume that you mentioned fights, so I assume that's one of them. Do we have enough data to measure recidivism rates, et cetera? Right,
so recidivism is one, violence is definitely one. Other types of infractions, there's lots of things that you can get in trouble for in prison that don't involve violence, but are still worth keeping an eye on, like in particular drugs is a problem in every prison. And so, all of those things are being tracked, all of them, and then a whole host of other things. But, they're all being tracked. The project has been up and running basically, like I said, since the beginning of COVID. Many of the recidivism, the people that have been released from Little Scandinavia and are now actually back in society, I think that's 100% perfect, but I think that's a small number of people. Because I do think a number of the people who are on it are lifers right now. So like, it just kind of depends on what you're tracking, right? Recidivism to me as a public official is the most important thing. That's what I'm tracking. Like, did the system do what it was supposed to do? Did it rehabilitate people? We know the answer to the current system is no. I did it again, sorry. We know the answer to the current system is no, but so, yeah.
I'm curious about how significant the recruitment and retraining of guards, correctional officials is going to be, because there's a culture in that population that I volunteered in prisons for 10 or 12 years in Massachusetts. My daughter now volunteers at Rikers. And you know, the level of, it's not just a question of saying you can have a more personal relationship or be more open with people. There's a culture of violence and an extraordinary culture of disrespect. I did a library program in a Massachusetts prison for 10 years, and over I was told, why are you doing this? These people are animals, they can't read. And that was just pervasive. And so it just seems to me you've got to change a lot about how these people are recruited and trained, and it can't just, almost starting from scratch.
Yeah, I think I basically agree. I mean, I think that, you know, you see at SCI Chester, it really comes down to the leadership of the facilities, first off, about what kind of behavior is tolerated and what is not tolerated. And I think that is up and down from, you know, people who are incarcerated, but also, you know, the staff and everything. And so I do think that it does have a lot to do with who the superintendent is, what kind of tone they set at each facility. But certainly that cultural gap that you are identifying and the way that things are currently run is one of the biggest potential barriers to it working. In particular, you know, look, Chester is one of the few SCIs that is located in an urban environment, close to a major city, and in Chester, right? So, but a lot of the other SCIs are not in those kind of communities. They are in rural communities, and the people that work there are drawn from those rural areas, which is not the population that's there, right? So that divide there has been identified as a potential issue, for sure. And I get the sense that they were pretty careful about who they assigned to SCI, Little Scandinavia, like which COs, you know. It may have been completely random or somewhat random which inmates were selected. I don't think it was random about who they picked to put in as, you know, as the people who were there, so.
So thank you for speaking today. One of the questions that I have is, there was a very successful program in Massachusetts at one point. It happened to be, this is back in the 80s, with one person being released was Billy Horton.
Yeah.
And so up until then, the program had actually been very successful. So how do you guard against the bias that exists where if one person makes a mistake, that the whole program then becomes tainted? How do you kind of counter that narrative is one of my questions. And then the other one would be, outside of the ones that you just mentioned, what do you think are the greatest obstacles to its success?
Yeah. So the first, I'm trying to think about how to answer the first question. So I think that one thing, okay, so we have a version of that in Pennsylvania, that what you just described, Willie Horton, where there was a guy who was released on parole, and I'm going to get the details wrong, so please, I apologize. I'm going to misremember exactly the facts or whatever. I think he killed like 3 state troopers or something like that. Like he got out, he was paroled by the parole board, and very rapidly he committed some heinous crimes, and I'm pretty sure they involved the murder of law enforcement. So that was in the 70s, and that was Pennsylvania. And before that, Pennsylvania had a pretty good clip of the parole board of pardons, and like people could get out. At least much more than they can now. But after that happened, there was a bunch of reform that made it much more difficult for people's applications to be considered. So we had that in Pennsylvania, that exact thing. It dominated the news, it dominated how lawmakers at the time approached the issue, right? So for me, like, we just have to kind of like change how we think about law enforcement first and foremost. I think that for politicians in particular, law enforcement is like an easy thing. It feels easy to be to call for stricter penalties, stricter sentences, and to make everything about the punishment and the after the fact, as opposed to thinking about approaching crime in a preventative way, right? But then also realizing that like most crime that happens, the perpetrators aren't caught, right? Most crimes that are reported that occur, there's never an arrest. And to me, that should be the bigger question of what are we doing that we're not solving these cases? I mean, there's a much higher rate now than there used to be in the police department. But, that to me is the biggest thing of like, we should be focusing on that part and not the punishment side of it as much, but instead we see it's easier to like catch 1 out of every 10 person and really throw the book at that one person, I think that's part of how it works. And then I just think it's cheap and easy for politicians to propose things that are stricter penalties because it makes people feel good, right? Like honestly, anytime you see, I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this, anytime you look on the news and you see like Ben's law, and Ben got hit by a bus, and now we're gonna have a special law to like make sure that they're stiffer. That all those tools exist already. If I get hit by that's a bad example. Let's say I get hit by a driver and it's malicious, whatever. The DA and the police have everything they need already in the criminal code to prosecute those cases. There's no need for a special law, but it looks good on TV to get up and be like, we're doing something about this, we're getting a special, so our criminal code, anyway, so all that to say, it's gonna take a change of our values of how we think about, criminal justice and what it is, and that's what the Norway thing offers, is they don't look at it this way. It's not this political, thing all the time like it is in the United States. They're actually trying to solve the problem, and what do you know? Like that looks like actually, sometimes people have to be removed from society because they're in danger, but it doesn't mean that you just warehouse people and give up on them. So I babbled for a long time, I'm sorry.
Hello, Peter.
Hi.
When you were in Scandinavia, were you aware of how visitors were treated and families? I visited Raiderford a number of times, and it's really difficult how visitors are treated. Also phone calls, also letters. Is there some difference in Scandinavia?
Yeah. We went to, actually, I was at Little Scandinavia on Thursday with my staff because there was a tour and we went on it, and we were talking about this because I said to them, I have two relatively new people who work for me, and they'd never been to a prison before, and I was like, you guys gotta come. As part of the orientation in my office, you have to visit Little Scandinavia. So but I said to them, look, the first thing I want you to notice is the kids area. Because that's like the first thing you realize when you walk into SCI Chester. They actually have a great setup in terms of like, they have a special area that is just for kids. It's away from pretty much everything. It's as close as they could make it to the door and to security as possible, so the kids aren't coming through the facility, which is also how the visitor system is set up at SCI Chester. But like I said, it really is different institution by institution based on who the superintendent is. With Little Scandinavia, they are already have the sort of the policies at SCI Chester around visitation, which I think are better than what you're describing that you've seen in Graterford. People can visit the unit. Lots of people do visit the unit. People are allowed to come specifically to the unit and visit the people on it. So,
Of course, you're afraid of people smuggling drugs and contraband.
I can't hear you. Something about drugs.
Contraband being smuggled in.
Oh, in terms of like, can people come in? I'm sorry, I misspoke. Like, in terms of if you're gonna have a visit at Little Scandinavia, you go and do it the way that everybody else at SCI Chester does it. Is that what you're asking? Like, you go and you do it in where they do their visitation.
I'm sorry, I can't really hear.
Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. In terms of resources, does it entail a lot more to provide this service?
No, not really. I mean, if you were to actually go full Norway and actually be like Norway, you'd have to hire like librarians, social workers, teachers. I mean, and that would get much, much more expensive. But the prison population is actually falling because for a variety of reasons, but the prison population is falling. And so I think the main thing that we have to decide is, do we close facilities or do we spread out and allow everybody their own bunk? Because I think you could do that, but you would have to keep these facilities kind of where they are. But most of the things that I've described, do they sound like things that cost a lot of money? Or, you know, the kitchen, you know, the bunks is a main thing in terms of physical, but the reality is that we have more and more space, so they're able to do it.
Hi Ben. I'm wondering if there's any movement towards catering toward people on the streets who are 302 worthy, getting into the system and getting treatment that they can right now.
Yeah, I would say that this is a separate issue from that, only because, you know, this is through the SCI system and through the prison system, and you need to have been convicted of a crime with enough of a sentence, you know. But if they look at doing something similar in the jails, right, you could have a potential for people who maybe were arrested on charges that were less than a year. But I don't know that that's the direction that you want to go necessarily. But I think that what we have in terms of the mental health crisis is that lack of stable shelter for a lot of people, that people aren't able to reach that level of stability. And anyway, it's I think a separate issue. So. Okay.
Just one more. Did the Norwegians learn anything from us?
That's a good question. I don't know, I haven't asked them. I should. We talked to them, obviously. I mean, there must have been things that we do that are different, that they were like, oh, we could do some things like that. But generally speaking, I don't think they came back and like, yeah, we should warehouse people.